It's no secret that Microsoft have been making a big deal about their Xbox compatibility, backwards compatibility and enhancements. And they are now back with a new boost, this time not just taking better quality resolution or texture filtering, no, they've gone the full hog and taken old games that run at 30 FPS and pushed them up to 60 or even beyond. How are they doing this? Why are they doing this? And how excited should we actually be? Let's dive in. So first things first, inherently nothing here has been touched by the original studio or any studio in terms of the game code and the engine. They all run inherently exactly as they did on the original hardware, be it the Xbox One S, the Xbox One X. There has been no changes. That means that you're getting boosts inherent to the operating system and the driver controls, i.e. the API, rather than any developer going in and updating the engine code, such as we've seen with updates from games like Gears of War or God of War, which I covered recently. Now, obviously, this is a little different. Unlike those titles where the developer can go back to the original code base, update FX, graphics, resolution, performance, and even turn on features that were already there but not running in the original deployed version to the Xbox One or the S. Here, what happens is Microsoft have the ability to update certain titles. This might be a huge portion, it might be a small portion, it all depends on how the engine is constructed, to enable them to be rendered at a higher refresh rate. All games have a timing loop. You have to have a sync point at various stages in the engine to be able to render a game as it is. Now, one of those is the rendering stage. When do you choose to output an image to screen? Now, many titles, many engines use what's called the V-blank stage. Now, this is an old school term back from when consoles and PCs used to be around, but old CRTs, cathode ray tubes, that's where the term really comes from. So how they used to draw to the screen is very different from modern TVs like LEDs, OLEDs, LCDs. So they used to have an electron gun, and that was an anode and a cathode at the back and the front, and that was a negative charge and a positive charge, and it would shoot electrons at the front of the screen that would be covered with phosphor, and they would become photons and therefore give you the image. And those would pulse the screen at the relevant level and colour and give you the image, and it would draw a raster line from the top left and go across all the way down to the bottom right. And then when it got to the end, the gun would then reset and go back to the top left. That point was called the V-blank stage. And that's where on old computers and consoles, that's when all the work was done to get ready for the next frame and move along. Obviously, more to it than that, I'm not going to go into it on this video. That's the V-blank stage. So in modern TVs, that's consistent, that's the same, but in modern TVs, that's just a point when the whole screen is drawn from the top to the bottom, or in modern games, it's actually from the bottom to the top. But it's still used to sync the engine, hence why it's now called the V-sync stage. So games often are timed by the V-blank stage. So the engine, the logic loop, the animation loop, the physics, all those kind of things in the engine, they can run autonomous, so they can run separately from the rendering rate. Think of it like a camera. If somebody's dancing in front of you or fighting, every photo you take is a point in time. That person still moves, everything still happens, you're just taking a snapshot. That is the frame rate time. So the engine's running in the background, but every time you take a snapshot and throw it to the screen, that's the V-blank stage. Now that could be at 33 milliseconds, i.e. 30 FPS, or it could be at 16 milliseconds, i.e. 60 FPS, or even 8 milliseconds, right up to 120 FPS and beyond if you have sufficient hardware. And with the brand new Series X and the Series S, there is a serious amount of horsepower in there, which means it can take these older games and run them in a much smaller window of time, i.e. a much smaller frame time, thus a much higher frame rate. So just like on PC, what you can do is you can tell a title or an engine that you are running at a certain refresh rate, so 60 FPS, and then you tell it to run at a half refresh of that, so 30 FPS, 33 milliseconds. So here what the engine they've done is they've tricked the integer number and doubled it. So they tell the console, they trick it, that it's actually running at 120 FPS rather than 60, but it still renders that at half refresh. So now it's rendering and flipping every 16 milliseconds rather than every 30. Because it doesn't know any different, and because the engine, the logic is all separately timed, it's not managed by that V-blank stage, it's not controlled with its physics, it doesn't speed up like some titles that have this and will have this if they try and do it. It will just run at the same rate, but you'll get more frames in the same time. And I can't say for definite, but I'm almost certain that's exactly what they've done. And that's exactly the same as a PC. If you go into your NVIDIA panel or your AMD panel and change the refresh rate, you can force VSync off, you can force VSync on, and then you can also force half refresh rate and things like that to actually improve frame pacing and delivery of frames in PC titles that aren't as good in the engine, because the driver can control it at a much better rate. Therefore, the benefit of what Xbox have with the way they've constructed their entire operating system and the level of abstraction that the hardware has, which is different to how PlayStation handled theirs. And the benefit is, it means they can do more with older titles by manipulating the OS and the infrastructure that the actual games run on, because they're not designed and dedicated to run on one piece of hardware. There's a layer underneath that they can manipulate. So what I'm referring to here is a very old process called HAL. Hardware abstraction layer. It's very old, it's not new, and it's exactly how Windows has been designed and how the Xbox consoles are designed. And that's the perfect compromise. I'm not saying these things can't be done on the Sony platform, they're just not as easy because the two paths are different. They have diversions, and that means wins and losses. And that means you can boost certain titles easier, or you can manipulate the operating system easier, such as things like, the saving process on the Xbox compared to how it is on the PS5. All of those things are the benefits and the negatives of having different paths. You can't have everything. Everything is a compromise. And this also comes down to the choices in the games and the engines that they can perform this on. Not every game and every engine will enable this, because some will be synced by this VSync level, and therefore the engine logic, the locomotion, the animation loop, the logic overall will speed up with that VSync doubling, and that will make the game unplayable. So only titles that enable this separation of the two will enable this option to be easily implemented without any work from the development teams. And that's the how. But what about the why? Well, again, this is all based on my experience and knowledge, but it doesn't mean it's fact. They haven't come out and said this. But logically, this is down to two main reasons. Game Pass is Microsoft's big ticket item. It's their focus going forward. They're not worried about hardware. In fact, they've said it's hardware agnostic now. It's running on whatever you can, PC or console. But what they're trying to do is enhance that and add value. It's their USP. It's their unique selling point. And a VAS, a value-added service, is adding something to make that even better, more attractive to us, the consumer, to buy. So buying an Xbox console, a Series console, you not only get the option of playing these games enhanced on the better hardware, but you can also subscribe to Game Pass and get a collection of titles. And in addition to that, you can play older titles on Game Pass that are enhanced with their extra effects, such as improved resolution here, or improved frame rates, or improved texture filtering, or improved loading. All of those things are a benefit, and they even come to you if you only have the disc. And this means that the return on investment from Microsoft is very quick. There's not a lot of effort here in terms of the work to get this particular boost working. It's more of a driver level, the testing of certain games, what they've done here, and then they roll it out, and then later in the year there'll be an update patch to the OS that allow you to turn these on and off, and certain games will be whitelisted that will work with this and won't be affected by it, as I mentioned before, and other games will be, and therefore they won't be in the list. And then you can just turn the option on and off if you get those few edge cases that cause you issues. And that's great. That's a massive enhancement, and that just entices and improves the brand of Xbox and makes it more valuable and more enticing for us to pick up. The second part is it adds value also to their xCloud, because if they're streaming these boxes and they've got them in racks and DC centers across the world, then it means that inherently the hardware might be subtly different, but the operating system, the software, is not. They don't want to change any of that. So you can all of a sudden take a title that ran at 30 FPS on your Xbox One, run it in the cloud at 120 FPS, and it fixes one of the biggest issues of streaming, and that is of latency to get the image back to you when you press a button on the controller. So you might see titles early on that actually run very close to what they run like locally on the local hardware, because you might see a 60 FPS stream, which is already going to be a massive improvement over a 30 FPS one, but you get back to your console much quicker, and therefore you get a cleaner image, a faster image, and you get very close to the same input latency. And largely, the general gamer won't pick up on it if it's only around 20 to 30 milliseconds slower. If the image is updating faster, it still feels better, even if you have to inherently get used to that lag. So a lot of that gets fixed with these two solutions. So it makes an inherent business sense, and it gives Microsoft a great return on that investment. So the amount of effort they'll do for testing and baselining these versions, they'll then widen and push out more and more titles throughout this year. I'm pretty sure this is just an early test bed. The largest portion of effort will come from curating the list to make sure there's enough on there and keep expanding them and testing them so that ones don't break that logic process I mentioned earlier. So with the likely how and why out of the way, let's talk about the what. So what titles have come out? Well, there's been a set of older titles right back to Watch Dogs 2, Far Cry 4, Sniper Elite 4, and they've done this to pick older titles to get a view of the stack across the older SDK, the older operating systems back from launch, and to the newer ones, so that any issues are known and therefore they can tweak them in the driver and just have a view of just how compatible this solution actually is. And by large, it looks very compatible indeed, as expected. But fundamentally, what they've covered here is a good selection with the boost from the Bethesda titles of the recent purchase that have come out this week. And I've covered these more in depth over on the RGN Games channel, so go and check out the RGN video on that. This is more of a deep dive into this. Now, generally, the versions they've done there, they use branching on the driver split. So when you go into the operating system and boot up the game, you choose to turn FPS boost on or off, and then that basically pushes you down a path. Now, some titles, i.e. Fallout 4 and Fallout 76, they have Xbox One X enhanced versions, which means they run at 4K 30 FPS. When you push it to FPS boost and run it at 60, it then downgrades that and runs it at the Xbox One version and runs it at 1080p 60, which I've covered, and it's pretty much a locked 60 on both the Xbox One Series S and the Xbox Series X. So those versions are perfect. Go and check that version out to check it out. But because of the fact you've got the resume state, the quick resume on these consoles, what you can do, and I tested this back then, but at time issues I didn't get time to put it in the video, you can actually run it at 4K 60 by literally going into the game, starting it with FPS boost off, i.e. starting the game at 4K 30, then you quit and go to another game, don't close the game, just move from a quick resume, and then in the other game, go back into that game, turn FPS boost on, which you can see we're doing on screen, and then resume the title. And then what that does is it bypasses the rendering resolution from the boot up stage or the engine, and it just literally turns on that half refresh, turns it back onto full refresh, or at least doubles the integer to 120 FPS, and voila, you now get the game running at 4K 60. And it's perfect to give us an example of being able to test the performance levels. So if we take some of the older titles such as Fallout 4, I covered that way back when on the original Xbox and PS4, and obviously it had serious issues in performance. It could dip due to CPU and GPU issues at many points in the title, and you can see some examples of my old analysis back then. So it could dip down to the low 20s at points. But if you run this at 1080 60 on both the Series X and the Series S, it's locked. It doesn't have any issues at all, pretty much. There's a few skips, but nothing major at all, and certainly not indicative of the hardware. Remember, it's still running these games in a GCN compatibility mode. It's not running them natively. They're not been changed. There's no engine update. So this is really just brute force PC boosts straight into the higher performance. But on the Series X, you can run these at 4K. And that means going from the 1080 30 version, which dipped right down to the 20s here, we can now get visibility of just how stressful the engine is. And predominantly at this resolution, it's GPU bound, i.e. it's triangle limited, it's fill rate limited, it's alpha limited, and all those areas in terms of long draw distance, very limited amounts of culling, high alpha, high geometry, all of those have a stress element on the GPU and thus cause dips and persistent dips. Now the Gamebryo engine, which originally powered the Fallout and Elder Scrolls title, was updated to the Creation engine, which they used on all three titles I'm covering here. So from Skyrim, Fallout 4 and Fallout 76, they all use that, and it's updated in terms of the visual quality, the textures, the detail, the draw distance. It's all very stressful, but they're not really designed to run it at these levels, these high draw outs. Certainly there's some culling on the shadow maps and the shorter range and the frustrum, but predominantly it's still an impressive title in terms of the lack of popping you get to see as you walk through the world. But running this at a native 3840 by 2160 is just too much when it's not been redesigned for the modern hardware in the Series X and the Series S, certainly in the RDNA 2, and certainly culling is their biggest issue. They don't cool very well, they don't cull in the frustrum, they don't cool things behind, so it puts a high overhead on triangle counts and just objects overall. So that means that it becomes very heavily bound. So this isn't a bug. I've seen this online, people saying that this is a bug. There's no way this is a bug. This is intentional. They've branched the path off so that when you jump in, it forces it to the older version because it knows that that's a locked 60 1080p. Now, looking at this, it would largely be perfect if they went back and updated it to 1440 and 60 on all of these games, and it would be perfect. Aside Skyrim, which I think is the right choice, and that's why they've left Skyrim at the 4K enhanced Xbox One X version, because it can dip, absolutely, the beginning section going through the woods, as I cover in my other video on IGN, it can dip down to the low 50s, and the early point, that part with the dragon's quite stressful. But again, long draw distance, lots of alpha, lots of heavy geometry, that can cause it to dip here to again, the mid 50s on the Series X at 4K. So it feels much better inside in combat. As long as there's not loads of things on screen and you're condensed into an interior section, it's pretty much a lock 60, and that's, you know, a big portion of the game, so that's why they've left it. But there are points when you play it, it can dip. But in the other titles, such as Fallout 4 and Fallout 76, you can clearly see that performance is an issue, and you can see why they made the right choice, which is to push it to 1080-60, because it really isn't a 60 FPS game at this point. And this would be the same on really much more powerful PC hardware. It's a very, very stressful engine. Do not take this as an indication of the hardware or how it's running. This is just what happens when you take very old engine code and run it on newer hardware and try to run 4 times the resolution. It's 4 times the pixel count, remember. So there's a lot more pixels here. You're going from 2 million pixels to 8 million pixels. And nothing's been scaled down to accommodate that. So there's lots of work optimization, as everyone knows it as, when engineers and developers cut down on some of the elements you can't really see to absorb the cost of that huge increase in fill rate. And that's why it's a really interesting example of the hardware. You can see in very many areas here on Fallout 4, it's somewhere into the 40s at all times, and it feels very, very jittery. There's no smooth motion. It can cause the locomotion as you turn in the camera or just working through the world can be quite jittery. And performance-wise, Fallout 76, it kind of shows you again that there's not been a huge change to the engine between those two games, because it's almost identical levels of performance with identical loads on screen. Again, it's a very static world in terms of the geometry, the fields, the grass. Nothing really moves, but it is a very dense world. There's lots of characters, lots of triangle count, lots of overdraw. It's not heavily optimized to run on, you know, various pieces of hardware. Thus, we get an idea here of brute forcing it through. But I wouldn't recommend going into this option. It's there if you want that image quality and you want to run it, and like I say, there's some parts in the game where it can hold 60 FPS. But predominantly for me, it's more of a curio. It's more of a look under the hood, just how it runs these games. And it really is an idea of just how stressful some of these older engines can be, because they just were never designed to run at these kind of stupidly high 8 million pixel fill rates. But I hope and look forward to more titles coming from Xbox in terms of this backwards compatibility boosts. Obviously, there's going to be a lot more from the Bethesda teams to boost out, but also I'd like them to look further back. So a classic one instantly would be the sublime and beautiful looking Rise, the CryEngine launch title on the Xbox One. We know there was a PC version released. It runs at 60 FPS, a very good 60 FPS. We know the engine inherently supports that split logic I mentioned before. So it'd be a great example for Microsoft to push that out. If they could boost that up to 4K, so that everyone would get an updated version of that 4K 30 on the older consoles if we can't do it, the Xbox One X, and then obviously 4K 60 would be perfect on these newer consoles, or even 1440p 60 on the Xbox Series S. There's a huge amount of titles that they can go back and look to, and I think it's really exciting if they have this option to try and bolster over the next few months the marketplace and the overall value of Game Pass on the Xbox when they're still making new titles, and they can get their head down and get used to delivering these games on the newer hardware. And I do think that this year is going to be very depressing for a lot of people. A little analog to how software development works, especially GPU work, by hiding that latency. Software development is very, very similar. The critical path is heavily where you develop for, even if you do an agile project. And I think that the pandemic of last year and still going on this year is going to have a very large detrimental effect to some of these titles that were probably, you know, planning to come out in 2021. Many of them may slip into 2022, and that means that things like this, updating older versions, and maybe, you know, a few more remasters and enhanced versions that they probably were planned will come out this year to try and compensate for the fact that a lot of titles will slip into 2022. But I do think we'll see some work from Bethesda, certainly on some of the things like Doom and Wolfenstein, to push that out to 120 FPS at high resolutions, and that would be a great benefit across the board. This is a great option for Microsoft to be able to go back to some of their older catalogue and just look at things they can tweak with a much lower overhead, but still an impressive return for us, the consumer, and most certainly us, the gamer. But that's enough of that. I hope you found this video useful and insightful, and a deeper dive into what's going on under the hood and just how you can test this yourself on your own Series X. And obviously leave your comments below on what you think is important, what would be good to be boosted on this new pattern and this new process from Microsoft. And remember, if you do like what I do, please like and subscribe and share, because that really helps immensely. But I will see you on the next one.